is presented by Jeffrey Dozer with a very interesting title, Assessing Soundscape Disturbance Through Hierarchical Models and Acoustic Indices, a case study on a shelterwood logged northern Michigan forest. I'm sorry for the delay, for the bit delay. Please go on. I see your presentation on the screen, so everything is okay.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for organizing. As was mentioned, my name is Jeff Dozer. I'm a graduate student at Michigan State University in the Department of Forestry. And I'm really looking forward to talking today about one of my dissertation chapters that looks at how we can use soundscapes to assess disturbance impacts on forests in Michigan. And so first, I'll just give a really broad overview of kind of the motivation behind this project. So acoustic recordings and acoustic data more generally are these really attractive kind of alternatives to monitoring across fairly large spatial extents. But one thing that we need to address is that these data can be really complex to analyze, and they can be somewhat messy. So first off, we can collect huge amounts of data, and then just lends to the question, well, how do we extract ecologically relevant information from these data? So of course, one of the ways that has been explored in ecoacoustics is to utilize these acoustic indices, which can kind of succinctly summarize these acoustic recordings into simple numeric values that we can interpret and try to extract ecological information from. And so what I'm proposing to do and what we did in this project was we combined these acoustic indices and utilized them inside a statistical framework, or called the hierarchical Bayesian model. And we used this together to look at disturbance impacts and how we can use these messy acoustic data and really understand the effects that disturbances can have on soundscapes, and then the underlying biological community that these soundscapes represent. And so I'm going to spend most of the time just talking about the case study that we looked at for this project, which was on a forest in the state of Michigan in the US, where we wanted to assess the impact of a shelterwood logging, both on the soundscape quality and the soundscape health in the area, and also on the acoustic or the avian community that underlies a majority of the sounds, the biological sounds in the soundscape. So shown on the right here is the study region. So again, this is in the state of Michigan in the United States, and kind of blown up on the bigger map on the left is the area which we had our acoustic recording set up. What we did is we had 4 what we called treatment sites in the darker shaded green area in the bottom of this map. And then we had 9 control sites that were dispersed throughout these couple of lakes called the Twin Lakes. And from about 2009 to 2018, there was a 1-minute recording that was obtained about every 30 minutes using these recorders. And they were song meter SM2s. In particular, some of these recorders were set out for different purposes. So there were large amounts of missing data at different locations. And ultimately, what we did for this case study was we were primarily interested in kind of the period of the year where birds are most vocal. So we only used recordings from June, which is the breeding period in this area. Kind of right in the middle of that period of time in 2014, there was a shelterwood logging that took place in the forest stand in the dark green shaded area where our 4 treatment sites were. And so this forest stand is a well-stocked natural mixed pine forest stand in the area. There is a fair amount of trees removed, and there was a 73% basal area removal for this logging. And so really what we wanted to do was just understand the influence that this shelterwood logging had on the soundscapes, and be able to quantify this to assess soundscape health and see what that means for the bird community that dominates the soundscape here. And so to do that, what we first did was we quantified the data using the normalized difference soundscape index, which is kind of this general measure of soundscape quality that ranges between -1 to 1, with -1 being dominated primarily by anthropogenic sounds and 1 being dominated by biological sounds in this region of the world. And so this seems relatively straightforward. So there's just this, this treatment. We have our control sites, we have our treatment sites, and we have data across a large number of years. But there's really some more complexities in the data that make this a bit trickier to parse apart the different things we're interested in. And so first, and probably the most important, is that there's really these inherent differences between the control and treatment sites. So as in kind of these large scale studies that occur in ecology, sometimes our control sites, we can never get them to be exactly equivalent to our treatment sites. And in this case, our control sites are much closer to Twin Lakes than are our treatment sites. And so, of course, because of that, there's going to be different birds that comprise the community in this region. And so the soundscapes will just inherently be different from each other. And so we need to account for that so we don't improperly associate this with the logging. Second, of course, is that we have numerous extraneous variables that we need to account for in our recordings. In particular, in this region, the primary source of geophony is rain, and so we want to be able to account for that in our models as well. And then, as I hinted at, as is the case with many monitoring programs at larger spatial scales, there's lots of missing data going on here. Most of these recorders were set out for different purposes, and we're just leveraging them for this case study. So we need a way to account for these missing data. And then lastly, we have this kind of repeated measures design where we're continuously recording the same sites over multiple years. And so these complexities kind of motivate the use of a Bayesian modeling framework that can allow for us to address all of these simultaneously, while still being able to parse apart and really understand the direct effects that the logging has on this area. And so what we did is we developed a model, and it's kind of depicted in this diagram shown here. So I'm going to walk through this. And in particular, what we first needed to do was define kind of our biological unit. And what we defined it as was this individual soundscape, which we considered the soundscape at a specific location at a specific time of day and a specific day of the year. So you can imagine over the 9-year study period that what we did was we obtained a series of recordings across different years for the specific individual soundscape. And then for each of those acoustic recordings, what we did is we computed the NDSI for each of those recordings. And then we transformed the NDSI such that we could model it using a normal distribution. And basically what our model turned out to be was a fairly standard linear mixed model where we have a mean structure. In particular, the mean structure is comprised of fixed effects, and then we have these random effects to account for the repeated measures aspect of the design. Then we have our variance structure that we're less interested in, but where we can parse apart the variance a little bit into a process variance, and then variance that's accounted for by these individual soundscapes. And so really where kind of the complexities are mainly addressed is in how we incorporate these fixed effects into the model. And so by kind of carefully designing how we do this, we're able to account for these inherent differences between control and treatment sites, the treatment effects, and then also account for rain. So I want to elaborate on that a little bit. So I just have shown here the definitions of these different parameters. I'm going to walk through that a bit just to, again, give you an idea as to how we really separated out the effect that this logging had on the soundscapes from just general shifts in the soundscape and other differences. So first we had our intercept that was just common across all recordings. We then had a distinct parameter that allowed us to assess the differences between the control and treatment sites that were not a result of the logging and just a result of differences between these locations. We then estimated a set of parameters that accounted for shifts in the soundscapes in this region that weren't a result of the shelterwood logging. So you can imagine if weather for some reason just resulted in shifts in the soundscapes in the region over this time period, or if multiple bird species are declining, then the soundscapes could change in their quality. So these parameters accounted for that. And then by including all those parameters, we're able to separately include parameters that really get right at the effects that the shelterwood logging had directly on these soundscapes, which is what this last set of parameters does. And then lastly, we have this parameter that accounts for the effect that rain has on the recordings as well. And we quantified rain just using a manual approach by listening to the recordings and indicating a binary variable on whether or not rain was present or not. And so I'll get into the results now, and we fit the model again in a Bayesian paradigm, and some of the ways we can visualize that is to use what are called posterior densities, which are shown here. And what we see, I'm going to specifically highlight in this top left portion of the graph, this alpha-2 parameter, which is the inherent differences between the control and treatment sites. And so how we interpret this graph is on the horizontal, we have this vertical line at 0, and if the density doesn't largely overlap, that means the effect is significant. And so what we see here is that there are these differences between control and treatment sites. And so it's crucial that we account for these in our model, because otherwise these differences would be attributed to the shelterwood logging. And then I'll point your attention to this figure, the graph in the bottom left here, which is the effect that rain has on these NDSI values. We see that this parameter is largely negative. So the presence of rain had a pretty strong impact on these NDSI values. By including this parameter in our model, we're able to actually keep these recordings in our analysis, as opposed to filtering out these recordings, which actually led to an improvement in our precision of our estimates. These middle parameters, I'll kind of blow these up on the right over here. These are the ones that we're really interested in, which are the treatment effects over the 5-year period. So on the horizontal axis here, what we have are the years, and these are the years that occur after the shelterwood logging, which occurred in early 2014. And then the y-axis shows the effect, and the effect is the difference between the transformed NDSI values in that specific year compared to what it was prior to the shelterwood logging. And so we see these really cool, quite clear results in that after the first 2 years of the shelterwood logging, there's this large decline in these NDSI values, which indicates kind of a decrease in soundscape health or quality. But then kind of immediately after that, we see this return to values that are either at or very close to the NDSI values prior to the shelterwood logging. And so ultimately what we concluded was that while we did see this kind of short-term decrease in the soundscape quality as measured by the NDSI, we saw this quick return to relative values, indicating no long-lasting effects of the shelterwood logging according to the NDSI. But of course, you're probably thinking, yeah, that's the NDSI. What about all the other acoustic indices that you could have worked or used in the model? And so that's what we did. We extended our model to a multivariate framework, which allowed us to estimate these effects simultaneously for a series of different acoustic indices. And here are the ones that we included in our analysis. And I think of particular interest are the two in the top left here, so the acoustic entropy index and the acoustic evenness index. And what we saw with these was kind of contrasting what we saw with the NDSI, which isn't all that surprising. But what it indicates is that these are metrics more so of the distribution of sound across the spectrum. And so what we found is that nearly all of these effects were significant across the 5-year period after the shelterwood logging occurred, which ultimately indicates, while the NDSI suggests the general soundscape health did not get significantly impacted by the shelterwood logging. Kind of the composition of the sounds in the soundscape was changing. And so pretty confident in saying that this is likely a result of kind of shifts in the avian community that are using this forest after the logging occurred. So kind of those early successional bird species that are coming into this area that are likely probably leading to these changes in these two indices. And it's been on my to-do list for a while to look at the specific species of birds that are in these recordings to confirm that, and hopefully I'll be able to do that relatively soon. And just to kind of wrap up here, just quickly summarize what I talked about. Through the case study, we saw that the soundscape health recovered after 2 years with the NDSI, but then these additional indices really suggested shifts in the composition of the soundscape and then also potentially in the avian community as well. And then just taking this a bit broader, I think these soundscapes are really useful tools for kind of an initial monitoring of disturbance effects on wildlife. So these data, comparatively to other approaches, are relatively cost-effective to collect. And they can really give us kind of an initial idea to see what's going on as a result of different sorts of disturbances. And then potentially if we see something that's a little bit, warning that something is having a negative effect on wildlife, then we can start to implement some additional approaches to kind of more understand those effects. And so that's about it. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the role that Stuart Gage played in this work. I'll kind of echo what Tim said in his talk yesterday, but I started my PhD in 2018 and I approached Stuart and he graciously came on campus a couple of times to talk soundscape ecology with me. And he generously shared these recordings with me and was very helpful in the initial analysis of these data. And I just, again, wanted to echo everything Tim said. It was really, really nice of him to share these data with me.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey, for your presentation. We have time for maybe one quick question. I don't see any rising hands, so I read something on the chat. One question relates to the rain. How you excluded or detected rain in your recordings?
Yeah, so the approach with rain was really quite simple. So I went in and I listened to all the recordings that we included, and I just indicated whether or not there was rain or wasn't rain. It would be really interesting to see how that compares to some of the automated approaches that have come out in the last year or two. I think there's a couple R packages that do that. So it'd be cool to compare how that worked.
And another question from Bernie Krause. Can you read it?
Yeah, so Bernie asked if I had a chance to compare biophonic consequences between selective logging and clear cutting. No, I didn't. That would be fascinating work, though. So these recordings were only available in the shelterwood logged forest. But that would be a really interesting study to see how that works, see the differences that soundscape, these different types of forestry and silviculture have on the soundscape.
Okay, there is no time for the other points to be discussed, and I have to go on with the next speaker. That's Sebastian Eduardi Munoz Duque. Sorry for the, but and the talk is on passive acoustic monitoring for identification and location of a migratory fish spawning area in a tropical Andean river. Sebastian, are you there? Okay, please, Sebastian, switch on your microphone and presentation. I don't see you.
Jan, it seems not in the panel list in this moment.
Yes, okay, but
What?
he just sent a message. He writes, yes, I'm here, but I don't see him.